Pastor Bruce here again, and I'm glad that you are joining us in our study of Mark's Gospel. In our last session, Mark recounts the Olivet Discourse as Jesus answered questions about his second coming. While Jesus made it clear that only God knows the day and the hour of his return, he provided teaching enabling us to know the season of his return. All three of the Synoptic Gospels, Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21, record the Olivet Discourse, and they are nearly identical. Today we turn to chapter 14, which begins on Wednesday evening and continues through Thursday evening. Mark provides substantial detail of the events leading up to Good Friday. For the benefit of us Gentiles, I want to provide a brief summary of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In our modern calendar, Good Friday is always on Friday and Easter is always on Sunday. In the Hebrew calendar, the day of Passover, as well as all of the major feasts, changes each year. This is because the Hebrew calendar is based upon lunar motion and our calendar is based upon the Earth's rotation around the sun. Passover is always celebrated on the evening of Nisan 14 and the day of Nisan 15. The dates of Good Friday and Easter float depending on the year. It just so happens that Passover occurred on Friday in the year 33 AD. This only happens a couple of times each decade and is one of the clues biblical scholars have used to determine the actual day and year of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. We want to remember that Passover is not associated with Good Friday, however. Passover celebrates God's freeing the Hebrew nation from Egyptian bondage and protecting them from the plague of death. The angel of death passed over the homes of the Jewish families that had marked their doorways with blood. It just happens that God orchestrated the alignment of Good Friday and Passover for the powerful message this sends to both Christians and Jews. God freed the Jews on Passover, and Jesus freed the world on Good Friday. With that introduction, let's begin by reading verses 1 and 2. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. As we already noted, the Passover was to begin on Friday. While we think of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread as the same thing, they are not identical. We know that the Passover commemorates God's protection from the angel of death. The Feast of Unleavened Bread commemorates Israel's exodus from Egypt and was named for the flat bread that the Hebrew people took with them when they made their hasty escape. This is recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 3. Because the two celebrations were so closely intertwined, the Passover and the feast eventually came to be used interchangeably. Together they make up one of Israel's three major feasts, along with Pentecost, or the Festival of Weeks, and then the Feast of the Tabernacles. Jesus knew that it was God's perfect plan for him to die in less than 2 days. As the Jewish priests were preparing the Passover lamb for sacrifice, Jesus was preparing himself to be sacrificed for many. That comes from Mark chapter 10, verse 45. God's plan was that the Son would die at a precise time on a specific date. Jesus will also return again on a precise time and on a specific date, as we learned in chapter 13. While the chief priests had already decided that Jesus must die, their planning was in vain. Their desire only had meaning because it was part of God's preordained plan. For 3.5 years, Jesus had walked and ministered in the Holy Lands. Herod could not kill him. In fact, with their best of efforts, the Pharisees and Sadducees had also failed to kill him to this point. Nothing was going to happen to Jesus until the appointed time. Let us continue reading at verses 3 through 11 as the stage is set for this appointed time. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," Jesus said. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them any time you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Mark interrupts the narrative at this point with a flashback to the previous Saturday to set the stage for us. We know that this event already had occurred because it is also recorded in John chapter 12, verse 1, Matthew 21, verse 1, as well as Mark 11, verse 1. While out of chronological order, the theme of this passage fits perfectly into the narrative of Jesus' preparations. The setting is the home of Simon the leper, who lives in Bethany. Jesus and the 12 had been invited to this home to enjoy a supper with friends. It is quite possible that Jesus had healed Simon of the disease for which he is named. As Jesus and the 12 reclined at the table, actually referred to as a triclinium, they ate and they talked. At some point during the meal, a woman enters. She carries an alabaster jar of expensive perfume. While Mark does not name the woman, John identifies her as Mary, the sister of Martha and of Lazarus. That comes from John chapter 12, verse 3. It seems that Mary was more attuned to Jesus' true destiny than were the 12. With humble reverence, Mary approached Jesus, broke the alabaster jar, and poured the expensive perfume made from pure nard on his head. A typical alabaster jar had a long neck with a small opening from which drops of the liquid could be poured out in small amounts. Mary broke the jar so the full contents, likely 12 to 16 ounces, could be poured out quickly. This fragrant nard oil was extracted from a plant native to India. Mark notes that it likely cost the wages of a man could make in a full year, 300 denarii, or 12,000 in today's money. Her actions were not well received by the other dinner guests. Some suggested that it would have been better to sell the perfume and give the money to the poor. In John's account, the primary distractor is named as Judas Iscariot. In any case, a number of those present began to scold this poor woman, Mary. At that point, Jesus corrects the misguided indignation by declaring, "Let her alone. Why do you bother her? She has done a good deed to me." Mary's behavior constituted a beautiful act of kindness and of worship. It was not at all a waste. referencing Deuteronomy chapter 15 and verse 11, the Lord reminded the disciples that they would always have the poor with them, and that they could and should help the poor at any time. Jesus concludes by reminding the 12 that they would not have Jesus much longer. Mary had the right priorities and understood the role that Jesus was about to undertake. She was aligned with God's will and with God's purpose. Judas Iscariot was not. By anointing Jesus, she was publicly declaring her love for Jesus. Knowing her heart, Jesus commended her on account of this expression of true worship. For 2,000 years, the testimony of Mary stands as a memorial of her love for Christ and her willingness to align herself to the will of God. Having recorded the kind words of Jesus towards Mary, Mark makes the transition to Judas in verses 10 through 11. No name in all of history is more infamous than Judas Iscariot. Though one of the 12, and with Jesus for over 3 years, he squandered that privilege and chose to betray the Son of God. But Judas could not deceive the Lord. After the Saturday supper in Bethany, Judas went off to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, perhaps the worst deal in all of history. Let us pause for a moment to discuss. Of what crime was Judas guilty? Do you think that Judas had a choice in this matter? Let us continue Mark's account of the Last Supper and verses 12 through 26. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparation for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent 2 of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large upstairs room, furnished and all ready. Make preparations for us there." The disciples left, went into the city, and found things just as Jesus had told him. So they began to prepare the Passover. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They were saddened, and one by one they said to him, "Surely you don't mean me?" "It is one of the 12, he replied, "one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man. It will be better for him if he had not been born." While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many," he said to them. "Truly I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it anew in the kingdom of God." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. In verse 12, the narrative moves forward to Thursday. That Thursday at 6 p.m. would mark the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the time when the Passover lamb was to be selected. Knowing that the time of his death was near, the Lord set in motion a plan that would enable him to celebrate the Passover with his disciples. It was likely Thursday morning when his disciples said to him, where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? The Lord responded to their question in a way that undoubtedly was perplexing to them. His cryptic answer was necessary because of Judas. If Judas discovered the location, he would undoubtedly alert the religious leaders, enabling them to arrest Jesus before the appointed time. So to keep Judas in the dark regarding the precise location, Jesus gave directions to two of his disciples. From Luke 22, verse 8, we learn that Jesus had selected Peter and John to do this task. Go into the city, Jesus states, without providing any names or locations. You will encounter a man carrying a pitcher of water. Jesus continues, follow him, and wherever he enters, there were to say, the teacher says, where is my guest room, in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Clearly, the Lord has prearranged this event in every detail. As Peter and John entered Jerusalem, everything happened just as Jesus had said it would. Jesus knew that it was critical for him to celebrate the Passover with his apostles because during this Passover, Jesus transformed the Passover celebration into what would become known as the Lord's Supper. Rather than celebrate the death of lambs in Egypt, the bread and the cup would signify the body and blood of the Lamb of God. Jesus' celebration of the Passover on the night before his death raises an important question. How could he celebrate the Passover on Thursday night when the Passover was celebrated on Friday? The answer lies in the fact that in first century Israel, the Passover meal was regularly eaten on 2 evenings. Those from the Galilee observed it on Thursday evening, while those from Judea celebrated it on Friday. Therefore, Jesus was able to eat the Passover with his disciples on Thursday night and still die as the Passover lamb on Friday afternoon. This is further supported by the fact that in 33 AD, Friday was also known as Preparation Day, the day before the Sabbath. To this point, the experience was much like any other Passover meal. The hand-washing ceremony would have been followed by the eating of bitter herbs that symbolizes the harsh bondage that the Hebrews endured while in Egypt. Flatbread bread would be broken, distributed, and eaten. Next, the group would have sung the first half of the Hallel from Psalms 113 and 114. Perhaps the 12 anticipated that they would partake of a glass of wine before the lamb was served. But at some point, Jesus changes up the celebration. Our first indication of this change comes in verse 17, when Jesus states that one of the 12 would betray him, one who is eating with me. Jesus, of course, knew who it was that would betray him. No doubt, Judas knew as well. The other apostles were caught off guard by this comment and in turn each asked and denied that they were the one. As wretched and foolish as Judas was, he could not alter the plan of God. God had this event scripted from the beginning as foretold by the prophets in Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, and Zechariah 12. It is important to note that, although God used Judas to accomplish his purposes, Judas was still responsible for his own sinful choices. Judas willfully made his own decision and acted upon that decision. Before Jesus could rightfully declare that, it would be good for that man Judas if he had not been born. Imagine the suffering Judas will face in hell, fully understanding that he was there because he was there of his own choosing. It is at this point, verse 22, that the 12 understand that Jesus is changing the Passover feast into the Lord's Supper. That Jesus said these things while they were eating suggests that this occurred at the time that the lamb was served. Taking a piece of unleavened bread, Jesus broke the bread and declared, "Take it, this is my body." In both Luke and Paul's accounts, a phrase is added to that, "Given to you, do this in remembrance of me." After distributing the bread as a reminder of Jesus' broken body, Jesus takes a cup of wine and declares, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many." In order to have a covenant, it was necessary to have the shedding of blood, which is a reference to death. Not only was this required in the Old Testament, as noted in Genesis 8, verse 20, Exodus 24, verses 5 through 8, as well as Leviticus 17:11, but Hebrews 9, verses 16 through 20, carries this requirement into the New Testament, the New Covenant. The forgiveness of sins requires the shedding of blood. This is what would occur on the cross in just a few short hours. As the conclusion of this first Lord's Supper, Jesus and the 11 leave the room and walk towards the Mount of Olives. Let us pause for a moment to discuss. What parallels can you see between the Passover and the Lord's Supper? Let us continue reading at verses 27 through 42. "You will all fall away," Jesus told them, "for it is written, 'I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered.' But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all of the others said the same thing. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going just a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for even 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping, because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning the 3rd time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." The Garden of Gethsemane is at the base of the Mount of Olives. Judas had left the group to do his bidding. At this point, Jesus said to the 11, "You will all fall away." And quoting from Zechariah 13 and verse 7, Jesus continues, "I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep will scatter." I suppose this was difficult for the 11 to understand. Judas has already been identified as the betrayer, but now Jesus was saying that they too would deny Jesus. It is understandable that Peter would bristle at this statement. For a brief moment, they all exuded faith, pledging to stick with Jesus to the end. While still at the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus asks them to pray, while he finds a place to pray as well. It is now late Thursday evening, and the priority of Jesus is to pray, as he knows what will take place very soon. Jesus is distressed. He prays to his Father earnestly yet honestly, that his desire is that the will of the Father be done. He pauses briefly to check upon the 11, but they are sleeping. This pattern repeats 2 more times. Pray a little bit, then they fall asleep. Finally, the time is right. The ordained time has come. God's plan is fully set. Let us continue reading at verses 43 through 51. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kisses him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have to come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. At this precise God-ordained moment, Judas appears with a crowd of armed men. As previously arranged, Judas walks up to Jesus and greets him with a kiss on each cheek. The armed men immediately pounce on Jesus, and by the authority of the Sanhedrin, they arrest him. For a moment, Peter jumps to the defense of Jesus, and in the process, he cuts off the ear of the servant. From John's Gospel, we know that the servant's named is Malchus. After replacing the ear of the servant, Jesus turns to the throng of people and calmly states, Am I leading a rebellion? While everyone present is listening to the words of Jesus, he declares that Scripture must be fulfilled. It is at this point that the 11 flee, just as Jesus told them that they would go merely hours ago. Verses 51 through 52 is only recorded in Mark's Gospel, and we are never told the identity of this young man. It is certainly an odd account, but it is also certainly not very important. Though some have speculated this might have been John Mark himself, the author of the Gospel of Mark, others assume that it was some random fellow, perhaps following the crowd of armed men. With that, let us continue by reading the remaining verses of chapter 14. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all of the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at some distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guard and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they couldn't find any. Many testified falsely accusing him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony to him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another, not made with hands. Yet even their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," Jesus said, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on clouds of heaven." The high priest tore at his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy." And the guards took him and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You are also there with the Nazarene Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I do not know or understand what you are talking about," he said. And he went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began calling down curses, and he swore to them, "I do not even know this man you're talking about." Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. While John mentions that they first took Jesus to the home of Annas, the 3 synoptic gospels skip that brief meeting and pick up the narrative at the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. Since all of these locations are within walking distance of each other, the precise path traveled is not known. What is recorded by Mark is that Peter followed the armed men as they brought Jesus to the home of Caiaphas in the middle of the night. Peter placed himself in a precarious position. No doubt he felt loyalty to Jesus along with a certain amount of fear as he stood near the fire just outside the home of Caiaphas. Meanwhile, inside the house, Jesus faced the high priest and members of the Sanhedrin as they conducted a farce of an investigation. There was no credible evidence against him. They simply knew that they needed to charge him with some type of a crime, before they could convict him and before they could murder him. According to Jewish law, the Sanhedrin was not permitted to initiate charges. They could only investigate, and even this was a farce. Instead of proving his guilt, the witnesses presented conflicting stories. Finally, 2 liars stood up to say that they heard Jesus say, "I will destroy the temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands." Twisting the words of Jesus, these false witnesses claimed that Jesus intended to destroy the physical temple, when the truth was that Jesus was referring to himself. Repeated efforts to concoct a case against Jesus had failed, and the high priest was getting desperate. Enraged by Jesus' silence, Caiaphas continued to barrage him with questions, finally asking, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" This was the most important question, and Jesus answered it immediately. "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." The Son of Man was a well-known title for the Messiah. In making this truthful statement, Jesus understood what the high priest would do next. Caiaphas tore at his clothes and declared that Jesus was guilty of blasphemy. Everyone present nodded in agreement with this statement. They were ready to act. They took the liberty of a few quick punches, and beat Jesus. In a few hours, it would be morning, and they would march Jesus before the Roman authorities. But before that, they walked. But before they walked to the Roman Praetorium, Mark has one last interaction to record, beginning at verse 66. A young servant girl notices Peter warming himself at the fire outside of the home of Caiaphas, and she calls him out. Peter denies knowing Jesus. Before this narrative is done, Peter will deny Jesus 3 times, at which point a rooster crows, signifying sunup on Good Friday. The sound of that rooster brought tears to Peter's eyes.